Now please convene the Committee on Finance.
Thank you, Chair Campbell. Will the meeting of the Committee on Finance please come to order? It is now time for the committee to consider today's consent agenda. Does any committee member wish to remove an item for separate discussion? Hearing none, is there any objection to the approval of the consent agenda? Hearing none, the consent agenda is approved. The committee has one item on today's discussion agenda. Item 3 is an information item providing the 2021-2022 final budget. The item will be presented by Steve Relier, Executive Vice Chancellor and Chief Financial Officer, and Ryan Storm, Assistant Vice Chancellor for Budget. Steve, please begin.
Thank you, Chair McGrory. This agenda item is intended to provide a brief recap of the state's final budget decisions related to the trustees' budget request for the 2021-22 fiscal year. And before we go into details, I'd like to just highlight 3 areas. First, when we began developing the 21-22 budget request last summer, it was based on Sacramento's projections of several years of very bad state budgets, and we braced for another year of a significant budget reduction. Now, even though that was on the horizon, we still developed a budget request for the state that demonstrated our priorities and our essential needs. And very fortunately, the forecast of economic doom did not come to pass. Secondly, instead of budget reductions, we're receiving a remarkable increase in our one-time and recurring funding. And as Chancellor Castro mentioned this morning, there really hasn't been a significant increase to the CSU budget of this size since 1984-85. This is due to the state's economic rebound and CSU's very impactful advocacy efforts. And finally, I'd like to thank everyone involved for their effective advocacy for what has turned out to be one of the strongest budget years for the California State University. It was truly a team effort that led to the state significantly investing in the graduation initiative again this year and the full restoration of funding from the past year's budget reductions. Many other needs were also met, such as funding for mandatory cost increases and student basic needs, as well as strong support for one-time deferred maintenance projects. This budget demonstrates that the governor and the legislature understand the central importance of the university to California's future. Assistant Vice Chancellor Ryan Storm will go into more detail on the final budget items that affect the university. Ryan, go ahead.
Thank you, Steve. So Steve just shared, this is one of the strongest budget years for the CSU. Now that is not a hyperbolic statement. It is true. On this slide are highlights for the 21-22 budget. The CSU will receive $550 million recurring increase. That is nearly a 15% increase over 2021 levels. The largest portion of this increase is, of course, attributable to the $299 million base budget reduction, or restoration, that unwinds the budget cut from a year ago. Also, one-time funding will nearly reach $1 billion. Most of that funding is dedicated to one-time facilities and infrastructure improvements. As you will see by the way of the following slides, effectively, the CSU budget has been fully funded by the state with this combination of recurring and one-time funding. A fully funded budget request is rare. The last time this happened, as mentioned earlier, was the 2015-16 year, and before that, it was the 06-07 fiscal year. On top of these direct to the CSU appropriations, hundreds of millions of dollars will begin to flow to the universities, will flow the university's way starting this year. This is because several state programs were created or were significantly expanded. In the near future, the CSU will be able to access new grant monies or draw down funding from other state agencies for facilities and infrastructure, student housing, financial aid, student mental health, service learning, and applied research and student work experience. I'll have a few slides for you that will dissect those highlights a bit further. Let's begin with the sources of new recurring or ongoing funding. As a reminder, the CSU requested a $556 million increase last fall. Now, at that time, we presented a reasonable request aligned to the trustees' budget priorities to have cuts restored and to continue investing in Grad Initiative 2025, among other things. But last fall, there was little prospect that any of this request would be funded due to COVID-19. Instead, the state anticipated multi-year operating deficits with a strong possibility for additional cuts to the CSU budget. And as Steve described, the economy unexpectedly rebounded, as did the state's tax coffers. This development allowed for a significant investment. Now, the far right column shows that the final state budget provides a $550.1 million in recurring dollars. In fact, all of the new recurring funding revenue is from state sources. Now, this slide shows the intended uses of new recurring funding and how those state decisions correspond to the budget request adopted by the board last November. This year's budget contains both specific allocations in response to our budget request and a lump sum allocation of funding to be spread across priority areas as the chancellor deemed appropriate. As such, funds have been allocated to campuses in the areas shown in final budget, that column of the chart. So let's briefly walk through the components. We requested $150 million for the 4th and 5th years of Graduation Initiative 2025, and the state fully funded this component. It includes $120 million to the highest campus priorities, as well as $30 million for basic needs initiative funding, as well as essential needs for student mental health services. We requested full restoration of the 2021 budget reduction, and the state did grant that request with $299 million. Now, the academic facilities and infrastructure request was not funded with recurring funding. Instead, significant one-time funding was provided for these types of projects, and I'll share those details in a later slide. For mandatory costs, the state fully funded those with $55.3 million to cover healthcare premium costs, to cover new ethnic studies requirement costs, along with funding for maintenance of new facilities coming online. The slight difference between the requested amount and the final amount is due to estimates made many months ago that have been refined today. And the governor and legislator added $18.8 million for other system-wide priorities, such as summer term financial aid for CSU students. Additionally, the budget includes $27 million in recurring dollars for campus-specific priorities, such as ongoing operating costs associated with the conversion of the Humboldt campus to a polytechnic university. In total, the final state budget will provide $550.1 million in recurring dollars toward our budget request and other state priorities. Now, I just shared the result of recurring funding. Let's turn to one-time funding. As shared in my regular updates, the state's large surplus includes revenue that is mostly one-time in nature. As a result, the state supported many existing programs and created new programs with one-time funding. The CSU is a beneficiary of this too. The nearly $1 billion in new one-time revenue is from state sources. Now, this slide shows the intended uses of new one-time funding and how those state decisions correspond to the amended budget request from earlier this calendar year. After the governor's budget proposal in January, it was very clear that the state would have a significant amount of one-time funding available to dedicate to the CSU. Shortly thereafter, the CSU pivoted to the strategy of pursuing a significant sum of one-time funding for facility and infrastructure needs. The result was $325 million for deferred maintenance and infrastructure improvement projects on CSU campuses. In addition, state leaders added $573 million for other facility and infrastructure projects. The most significant of those was $433 million for the conversion of the Humboldt campus to a polytechnic. State leaders added $47 million of other system-wide priority projects, such as emergency grant aid to students, and faculty professional development and hiring. Additionally, the budget includes $31.3 million for campus-specific priorities, such as one-time investments in nursing and healthcare academic programs. In total, the final state budget will provide $976.3 million in one-time dollars toward our budget request and other state investments. So those were the details of the final state budget items that affect the CSU. Steve has some concluding remarks.
Thank you, Ryan. So to sum up, the CSU budget request was essentially fully funded, and our previous year's budget reduction was fully restored, our mandatory costs were covered, and the graduation initiative was funded. And the state provided hundreds of millions of dollars for one-time facility and infrastructure investments. This means we can address many of our most critical and acute maintenance and infrastructure projects, and we can sustain momentum on closing equity gaps and getting our students to their degrees in greater numbers. This budget means that the educational and experiential opportunities will improve for our current students and for those students entering the university this fall. So as we close this year's budget process, I'd like to specifically thank our students, the members of this board, our campus presidents, staff, faculty, and administrators for making the case in Sacramento that a consistent investment in the California State University and its students ensures a strong future for California. I also want to thank our alumni, our union partners, and California business leaders who advocated so effectively on our behalf. Those efforts were noticed by state leaders, and coupled with the good fortunes of the state budget, led to a positive budget year and a very strong outcome for the university. Chairman Gorey, that concludes our report, and we're happy to address any questions.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Ryan. And I also want to thank all of the CSU stakeholders who participated and advocated in this process. I think the legislature and the governor's numbers and what they have provided to us shows their confidence in our ability to deliver, and now we just have to execute. I also want to thank personally Tony Atkins and the Speaker of the Assembly and the governor for participating so much in all of these discussions that went on behind the scenes to get us to where we finally landed. It was a very effective governmental process. Doesn't always happen. I have a few questions, Steve. We were involved in some discussions about a multi-year budget. Where did those end up going?
Good question. As many on the board who have been on the board for a number of years know, we've always advocated with the state, both with the previous governor and the current governor and legislative leaders, to provide a commitment to a certain budget amount over a series of years. So we did have a number of discussions this year with people from the Department of Finance and the governor's office and others about that. We were not able to come to an agreement on an amount. As we were talking about numbers, the numbers were so low that they would have represented a much lower level of support than CSU has experienced over the last couple of decades. So we have not been successful yet. It doesn't mean that we won't be successful in the future. I think there is a lot of advantages to having a multi-year budget that gives campus presidents a much easier ability to plan for programs over a series of years. So it's still high on our priority list, but we just haven't been able to get the numbers to work yet.
Okay, and my second question is, the governor originally proposed $4 billion for housing assistance for UC, CSU, and the community colleges. That then became $2 billion. And I know we were advocating for some looser language so that we could address other infrastructure priorities. Where do we end up on that?
I'm going to let Ryan describe where we are on that. Ryan, do you want to take that one?
Sure, you bet. Thanks, Steve. Yes, the budget plan is for $2 billion to be used for capacity, what that was being coined capacity expansion, or essentially new buildings so that we can grow as an institution, as well as student affordable housing. So it's a shell of a decision. So we have $2 billion, the state has set aside $2 billion for this. What the plan of the state is now is over the course of this summer to really flesh out the programmatic details and put that into law. As you are well aware in our updates in the past, there are literally hundreds and hundreds of one-time and ongoing programs that were created or expanded in the state budget this year. And there just wasn't enough bandwidth by all the policymakers to really put their heads together and really make a really sound program going forward. So at least the money's been set aside, the principles have been laid out. As far as the details going forward, that will be worked out. And obviously our voice will be involved in that conversation as well.
Chancellor Castro, this is kind of a question for you. It's a tough one. This year is a little awkward in terms of these individual campus allocations, and there was just so much money to be distributed on a one-time basis. I've always thought we had an unwritten kind of rule or policy that the campuses wouldn't be up there individually trying to get allocations. Obviously, if the legislature makes that decision, you're not going to turn the money down. But I'm concerned that we are moving into a system where if there's individual campus lobbying, we're going to be in a pretty chaotic financial state. And I know there've been some suggestions that those individual allocations by the legislature should be taken off the top of what those campuses would have gotten anyway. And, we have a 5-year capital improvement program that we approved. And somehow we're kind of going around that capital improvement program with this approach. Hopefully it's unique to this year, but I hope that we're going back to the old rule, which is we don't want the individual campuses up there lobbying for individual allocations because it's going to screw up the set of priorities that we've set up for the entire system.
Thank you, Chair McGrory, and I agree with you completely. There's been no change in our approach. I think the change has been this unique year where there's been more money available for different projects. And, the one big example at Humboldt that was really initiated by the governor. There are some different special circumstances around the others, but you are exactly right. We need to prioritize our campus plans. And so we will take that into account as we're working to implement the $325 million plan. And then as we look at the $2 billion opportunity, we're going to be focused on our system priorities. And I'll be having a conversation with the presidents again in August to make sure that we're all crystal clear on this. But there's been no change in plan. I think it's as you said, it's a unique year.
Okay. Questions? Trustee Sebelius.
All right, I join in the rejoicing about this fabulous budget and in thanking the legislators and our team in Sacramento and all the stakeholders who have lobbied for this. It is indeed fantastic news, and it gives me pleasure to look at these numbers. However, I'm missing something here. All the money that is coming to us has already been allocated. And in the past, in our trustee agenda, when we got the beautiful balance sheet of our ask and what we are getting, I remember there was always a line of faculty compensation. And I know that CFA, the faculty union, is in bargaining right now with the administration for a new contract that is commencing the next academic year. And I certainly hope as a faculty member, and so do, I guess, 28,000 others, that there will be an increase in their salaries. Now, if that should happen, then where would this come out from, since all the money we are supposed to get has already been allocated for a lot of other things than faculty compensation?
So because we are now treading on collective bargaining, I don't want to say anything that is going to in any way interrupt that. Maybe I can turn it over to Evelyn just to address the collective bargaining issue. Evelyn, do you want to take that?
Thank you, Steve. Actually, not an issue at all. As you all know, we are in the midst of collective bargaining and salary is on the table. So we did receive a proposal from CFA. We will be meeting with them later this month and we will be then countering their proposal. So we are in discussion about salary. As of yet, however, we haven't proposed ours. That will happen at the end of this month.
Well, this is exactly my question. Should there be an increase, whatever size it may be, where would it come out from, since every single million is already allocated to some expenditures?
That is still to be determined. It doesn't mean that it can't happen. It just still has to be determined. And again, I'm not going to go into any more details because I'm not sure it's appropriate given we're at the bargaining table, but there'll be more to come on that.
I think, Romy, the answer is
Thank you.
we have to bargain in good faith, and whatever happens at the table will then be brought back to the chancellor's office, and we'll have to balance the budget accordingly.
Thank you, Trustee Sebelius.
Chair Kimball.
Yes, thank you, Steve, for that presentation. I'm just curious, going back to that $2 billion one-time funds that are going to be divided amongst the three segments. Do we, Ryan mentioned it's a shell right now, but so do we not know what portion of that is that divided equally? Are there, and I noticed in the report above that on page 4, there's discussion of the funds that we will need to apply for as grants. So I'm just curious, do we know what portion of that $2 billion we will be getting yet?
Short answer is no. There is more intent and more detail that I didn't share earlier, but you brought it up, Trustee Kimball. The idea with what was the shell that I described is that the University of California and Cal State University would be eligible for the capacity expansion or the buildings for new enrollment. So that's part of the principal decision that was made. And then the other part for affordable student housing would be extended to community colleges, UC, and CSU. But the state hasn't decided of that $2 billion how much will go to each of those buckets, to what segments. Obviously, we would love to have access to more of that than less from the CSU's perspective, because we have a lot of need in those areas. But there's still a lot to be worked out in that. But essentially, I'm almost at the end of all the detail on that particular proposal that where it has been adopted so far. That's about as far as it has gone in terms of what the state has made a decision on that program.
Okay, thank you.
It could be a healthy source of infrastructure money to accommodate the new expanded enrollment.
Exactly.
Yes.
Okay, Vice Chair Fong.
Thank you, Chair McGrory. So last year, we were planning for severe budget issues for the next 3 years. And we had plans for our rainy day fund. So I was wondering what is going to be happening with our rainy day fund, where are our plans, and are we going to refund it?
Trustee Fong, it's a really good question. One of the things that has complicated the reserve picture is not just the state of California providing us a budget increase rather than a budget cut, but also the fact that the federal government provided a fair amount of one-time dollars to assist with institutional needs that were related to COVID-19, either related in the way of lost revenue, and there was plenty of lost revenue, as you know, or increased expenses associated with, trying to prepare classrooms to be safe during the pandemic. There was, I think, an initial drop in reserves because campuses were, scrambling to fund costs. But those reserves over time are going to be replenished. And, there's always a lag between when we see the actual reserve numbers and as they're being spent. And there's still quite a lot of federal money for COVID-related revenue and expense that's out there, and that will affect the reserves as well as, of course, this money. So the answer, I guess, the short answer to your question is yes, they will be replenished. And we'll be reporting back to the board in the upcoming fiscal year once we have the numbers as to where those reserves sit. Thank you, Trustee Fong, for your question.
Trustee Raines.
First, thank you, Steve and Ryan, for this wonderful budget and all your efforts, and especially to all the other stakeholders who may be listening onto this call for their effort in help passing this budget. I just had a question, and I want to thank you both for answering my questions and other conversations. I wanted to know a little bit more about the student grants that are in the budget, how they would work, if we're still trying to determine the process for that. I know that'll go to our low-income Pell students, so just a little bit more information about that.
Yeah, so originally the governor had proposed back in January to spend $30 million of one-time money for emergency grants to students. The budget, when it was adopted, does it still include that $30 million? There are some criteria outlined in the budget bill, but we haven't quite gotten to that point. The governor just signed the budget technically last night, or on Monday night, I'm sorry. Yes, last night was Monday night. Sorry, this week is already, I'm way ahead of this week already. But so he signed the budget last night. So we still have some work to do in terms of programmatically, allocating that funding out to campuses.
All right, thank you so much. I really appreciate you too.
Are there any other questions? Chair Kimball, this concludes the business of the Committee on Finance.
And thank you, Trustee McGrory.